Alright y'all, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to go through my top 5 favorite classes in Baldur's Gate 3. There's two ways I'm going to be weighing how I rank these classes. One, how much do I love the class fantasy? And two, how good is the class in Baldur's Gate 3? So I'm taking both of those factors into consideration when for this ranking list. Now, one disclaimer I want to get out of the way is the fact that there are 12 classes in Baldur's Gate 3. They are all viable in Honor and Tactician mode. So if your class isn't on this list, it really doesn't mean shit. So let's get on with the video. Now, starting off this list, number 5, we're going with Ranger. I love the class fantasy of Ranger. They are this like wilderness hunter that also is protecting some sort of border or hunting some sort of prey. And just the aesthetic and the class fantasy with Ranger, I absolutely love. Now, when it comes to how they actually play in Baldur's Gate 3, they are really strong in the early game, kind of okay in the mid game, and then I think they do spike again in the late game, like Act 3. They have 3 pretty good subclasses. The standout is Gloomstalker. Gloomstalker is one of, if not the best class in Act 1 in the early game because of their Dread Ambusher and the fact that they get +3 to initiative just right off the bat at level 3. Now the other 2 subclasses, Hunter and Beastmaster, get really strong in the late game. Beastmaster in particular, their pets get extra attack. So that's 4 actions, regular actions between the 2 of you. And then the Hunter subclass essentially gets their regular attack replaced with this nice AoE in Volley or Whirlwind. If this was just a list based on class fantasy, Ranger would be in my top 3, but we're also factoring how they play in Baldur's Gate 3. And for me, they sit at number 5, so we can go ahead and move on to number 4. Number 4, I'm going to go with Cleric. Now the class fantasy of Cleric, I don't like as much as Ranger, but how they play in Baldur's Gate 3 is just phenomenal. I rack my brain and lose sleep over which subclass I'm going to play as a cleric. They have really fantastic options such as Life, Light, Tempest, and War Cleric. All of them bring in like a unique flavor to their base kit, and their base kit just by itself that every cleric get is phenomenal. I feel like in every one of my playthroughs, I bring a cleric just because of the sheer amount of options they have. Now, when you think of cleric, you might be thinking like, okay, this is just a like support class that heals and maybe buffs your allies. No. They can be a frontline spellcaster or a ranged spellcaster. They have a lot of different options on top of being kind of a support character as well. And the cherry on top is the fact that there's so many pieces of gear and equipment that synergizes with something like radiant damage, that you can create that radiant damage or the radiant orb and reverberation feedback loop that makes this class an absolute like solo menace. Prior to BG3 launching, Cleric would not have been in my top 5, not even close, but after spending so much time with the game, I have absolutely fallen in love with this class. So at number 4, very strong Cleric. At number 3, I'm putting Sorcerer. Now Sorcerer I almost had at number 1 because the class fantasy I thought was okay, but how they play in Baldur's Gate 3 is absolutely nuts. But going back to that class fantasy, I'm not the biggest fan of sorcerers, like just a spellcaster in general, like mages or wizards. Not really my stick. But then, well, gee, Mr. Nomad, how the hell is it all the way up in number 3? Well, that's because of how goddamn good it is in Baldur's Gate 3, and not to mention its multi-class potential, where if you have spell slots, you bet your ass you can take Sorcerer and probably make that spellcaster a little bit better. And so what makes them so good in BG3 really just comes down to meta magic. This class feature essentially makes them busted as a spellcaster. Not to mention their 3 subclasses, Draconic, Wild, and Storm Sorcery, all really strong as well. So if this was a list just based on how strong each of the classes are, then Sorcerer would be number 1, if not really close to number 1. They're just insanely strong, so I couldn't keep them out of the top 3. So let's move on to the final 2 now. At number 2, we have Paladin. I love the class fantasy of a Paladin. These heavy plate wearing righteous warriors, usually maybe imbuing their weapons with some sort of divine light or elemental type. They are these holy warriors that have a code, an oath that they take that basically fuels their magic in some sort of way. And in Baldur's Gate 3, they are like the best class when it comes to single target damage. Now, admittedly, in Baldur's Gate 3, all 4 of their subclasses kind of all play the same, where it's just you just divine smite, and there's nothing wrong with that because it is very satisfying. But I do love the little nuances you get with Vengeance Paladin, Oathbreaker, Ancients, and Devotion. They each have their own little niches, like Ancients, for example, a great frontline healer, as well as kind of this tanky character as well, with their auras that can cut spell damage for anybody who's in the radius in half. That is really good for like a frontline tanky support character. I absolutely basically love everything about Paladins, so that's why they sit at number 2. Now we can move on to number 1. And actually, before we get to my number 1, we're gonna give an honorable mention shout out to Bard. Now, the class fantasy of Bard, I just do not vibe with at all. This like spy, musician, very charismatic, kind of goofy, like it's again, not my vibe. But what they do in Baldur's Gate 3 is absolutely awesome. They are so dang good at basically everything. They're this jack of all trades, but they excel at everything, like I just said. They're just crazy good as a face character, as a martial character, and as a spellcaster. So although the Bard is not my favorite class, I cannot deny how strong it is in Baldur's Gate 3 at just everything it does. So it does earn the honorable mention spot. So let's go ahead and move back on to my number 1. At number 1, we're going with Fighter. The class fantasy of Fighter is just limitless potential. Now you might be thinking, gee, no man, Fighter, that's kind of boring. And I gotta tell you, you are so wrong. Fighter is only boring to those who don't have an imagination, which is kind of weird because Baldur's Gate 3 and BG3, I feel like would attract the RP, the roleplay crowd. So not having an imagination, I don't know what's up with that. But Fighter is just, there's so many things a fighter can do. Do you want it to be like a marksman that uses a bow? They can do that. And they're probably one of, if not the best at doing that. Do you want them just to be a frontline character with a sword and a shield? They can do that too. Do you want them to dual wield? Yep, they got you covered there too. They can wear every armor and use every weapon. So then let's talk a little bit about the subclasses. We've got Eldritch Knight, we have Battle Master, and we have Champion. Champion is the only one that is kind of boring there, but honestly, Champion for multi-classing is pretty essential for those classes that you want to do a lot of crit damage with. So Champion's not completely useless, but it definitely is the weakest one out of them. But the other two, Battle Master is probably one of the strongest subclasses in the game. For me, it definitely is at the top of the charts as well because of the battle maneuvers and the fact that they come back on short rest. You just go the distance with a fighter as far as you never really run out of resources. And also fighters in general, they get extra feats as well. So you just get so much flexibility with a fighter. On top of that improved extra attack they get at level 11. So this is a super self-reliant class overall that you don't really need help from anybody else. You can do it all on your own. But if you want to throw a little bit of magic in there too, and you don't want to be like tied down by oaths or tenets or something like that, then you have Eldritch Knight. So hopefully I've maybe sold you a little bit on Fighter as far as like why is it so good and why I love the class fantasy, because you can be something, yeah, like I said earlier, you can be something like a marksman, some sort of like veteran soldier, a dual wielder. You can just do anything with a fighter. So those are my top 5 favorite classes in Baldur's Gate 3. If you made it this far, get your veteran fingers out and let me know your top 5 favorite classes to play in this game. Consider hitting that like and subscribe button, and yeah, I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace and take care.